In today's video, we'll be taking another look at CSS marquees. This time, we'll be taking it a little bit further than we did last week. In last week's video, we created a text marquee. But in order to make this marquee repeat itself, we had to make some repetition in the text. However, in today's video, we'll be taking a look at the logo marquee. And in that logo marquee, there is no repetition in the contents at all. So I also wanted to make a version of this marquee where there also is no repetition in the HTML. And that is what we will be building today. Let's see how we can achieve that. As a starting point of today's video, this is what we have. What you see here is a set of logos, or maybe you could even call them cards. And one thing you should notice here is that they all have the exact same width. And that is where this marquee differs from last week's, where all the text had a different width. Because in order to not have any repetition in the content, all marquee items need to have the exact same width. If that is the case for you, lucky you, you can skip any repetition in the marquee whatsoever. Let's also take a quick look at the HTML of the starting point. What you see is we have a few divs. First of all, we have the marquee items where there are the logos that are in there. And these marquee items are the cards, you could say. Then we have a wrapper around it, which is called track, just like we did with the text marquee too. And then as a wrapper to that element, we have our marquee element. All of these we're gonna need in a second to pull this animation off. In the CSS, you see that there's mainly some stylings to make the cards look nice, and that's pretty much it. To show you the approach we're gonna take, I went ahead and made this very beautiful Excalibur drawing. Imagine the outer rectangle being the full marquee, and then all of the red items being the different cards inside of that marquee. In the text space slider, we will make sure that we had at least two groups of exactly the same items, because that way we can move both of these, but only move it halfway, because at that point you would have exactly the same elements in view again, and then quickly swap it back to the beginning. That is, in essence, the way the text-based marquee worked. However, in this case, we can do it slightly different. What we can do is we can take all of the items individually, and instead of moving the track, we can animate the children. And that is because we, for example, know that we want these elements to move from right to left over a duration of 20 seconds. If we then also know that we, for example, would have 10 items, that would mean that if we animate them one by one, but all with a delay of 2 seconds, which is 20 divided by 10, then all of them would be slightly delayed and would exactly fit right after each other. Because in the 20 seconds, which this element would take to get to the other side, it will be at the end of its cycle and it will automatically move to the starting point again because the animation will loop. And at that point, all of the different items have already crossed their 2-second delay. So this element will then be the only element that is on the stack and then will start moving again. And the reason we can do that is because we know all of these items have the exact same width, so all of them need to have delay of the total duration divided by the number of elements. If they all would have a different width, then we couldn't calculate how long the delay of the next element would be. Okay, let's code this because I think it will make much more sense then. The first thing we will do is we will start simply with 3 logos, so everything will be in view and I can show you how this works. So we comment these out and then we only have 3 logos left. And if you do that, you also might notice that the elements just became larger again. And that is because our wrapper is display flex. And by default, all of the elements try to fit in view, so all of them shrank in size. That is something we also need to prevent in a second. So to replicate that behavior, I'm gonna take our marquee wrapper and I'm gonna say that the width of this item is 600 pixels. And I'm choosing 600 pixels for now because our marquee item is 300, so that way we will see 2. If you do that again, you see that the items shrank. We can fix that by going to our marquee track and adding a width of max content, because then you see that the element already grew. And if we quickly inspect that, you will actually see that our marquee track now is wider than the marquee wrapper, which is the 600 pixels. So to remember us about this, I'm gonna add a border for now, 1 pixel solid. And let's make it white, I think. So that way you can see what is in view and what actually should be out of view. So the next thing we have to do is stack all these cards on top of each other outside of the marquee. Because this way we can then animate them one by one. Stacking them all on the right side, we could do of course with position absolute, but in this case, I'm gonna opt for a more modern solution with CSS Grid. So we're gonna go to our track, and we're going to change it to display grid. If we only do that, you'll see that CSS tries to fill in where these elements go and puts them all in their own row. That's not what we want though. We want to stack all of these elements on the right side. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a grid template columns And then we have to define a value here. You will see that Copilot suggests repeat 3,1fr, which would mean that if we do that all of the elements again get put next to each other. But in order to overlap them, we need to define our custom columns. So the columns I want to create are two columns, one column called track, for example, and a second column called resting. And then we need to have specific widths for these columns. The first one would be 100%, or at least it should be 100% of its parent wrapper. And then the next one will be 0 pixels. And by making the column 0 pixels, it won't have a width, of course, but we can still assign elements to that position. However, if we would write our columns this way, you will notice that the 100% is actually not what you expect. But in order to better show you what that 100% is, we first need to assign this marquee item to the correct slot. That we can do by adding a grid area and assigning it to the name grid area resting. So this way they're all put in that 0 pixel column. And if we then would go back, you will see that indeed all of the cards are stacked on top of each other because they're all assigned to the exact same column. However, what you also notice is, like I said, the 100% who would enable the grid lines is suddenly only half of this element. So that means that we need to use a different value to make the column extend the full width. And this width of the parent we can get by using CSS container queries. Something that's also fairly new and has many use cases, but also brings us a new unit called CQW. And the CQW unit stands for container query width. It works as follows. What you need to do is you need to go to the parent element, in this case our marquee wrapper, so not the track, but the marquee element, and you need to define a container type. If you say container type inline size, we define a container for the width of this element. By doing that, we are now able to get the width of this element inside any of its children. So instead of using 100%, we can now use 100 CQW, which again will take 100% of this marquee element. So if you would go back, you will also see that all of a sudden all these elements are stacked on the right side of the parent element. And you also see in the inspector that this element has been turned into a container. And now we have stacked all of these elements on the right side. And while I've been explaining that to you, if you're even still here, you might be thinking, why is this guy even trying to do this with CSS Grid instead of simply using position absolute? Well, there's two reasons for it. One, because I want to show you how you can do this with CSS Grid plus use container queries in a really interesting way. But secondly, and even more important, if you would do this with position absolute, all of a sudden you also need to start setting fixed heights, for example, on the parent, because everything gets pulled out of the flow. And the nice thing with CSS Grid is that, for example, the parent still keeps its height because the elements are still within the grid, and even if they would grow, the grid will simply grow with it. So yeah, it might feel a little bit complex, but as soon as you know what you're doing, I think this is actually a way nicer approach. But I think it's time to start animating these cards and show you exactly how this works. First thing I want to do is I want to add a keyframe animation, add keyframes, marquee move, and then we're going to add a to keyframe where we're going to say transform, translate X, and then we're going to move it somewhere. If we would add -100%, then the 100% will be the width of the card itself. Let's first see how that looks. If we would go back to our marquee item, we can now add a animation on there and we can say marquee move, for example, 5 seconds, linear, infinite. This way, the card will move over 5 seconds towards that -100% value. And if you look, you see that our cards are indeed moving and they're still moving all at the same time. But what you'll also see is that this 100% is indeed the width of the card. So we need a different kind of value here. And that value we can use is actually again the CQW unit, because this unit is the width of our total container. Let's go back in here and let's change it to -100 CQW. And then you will already start seeing that the element moves over the full width. It, however, jumps back before it gets out of view because it only moves to the left. So we also still need to subtract the total width of this card. Luckily, we can do that in the transform by adding a calc of 100 CQW minus 100%. So now we subtract both of these units and you will see that the element even moves further out of view until it's completely hidden, and then it will simply start over. Let's give our marquee also a little bit of margin on the left side, just so we have some room to see it go out of view too. And then you will see that it completely moves out of view and then starts over. But we see all of the marquees moves at the exact same time. So what we need to do next is we should add in a delay. Remember that delay should be calculated based on the total duration the card will move, as well as the number of elements. So that means that we're going to introduce a few CSS variables. First, I want to add a variable called speed, which we, for example, going to set to 10 seconds now. And then the speed variable we can actually use inside of our animation. We can say var speed, and everything should still work exactly the same. The next thing we need to know is we need to know the total number of elements. For that, we're also going to introduce a CSS variable, but I'm not going to add that to the CSS. I'm actually going to add that to the HTML. This way you can dynamically render it when rendering the page, for example, coming from your CMS or in your template in general. This way it's dynamic configuration and it's not part of your styling. So let's hop back into the HTML, and then we're going to add a style prop on our marquee element. We're going to say style is num items, for example, which will be 3. Then since I'm using TypeScript, I need to add React CSS properties on here because otherwise it won't recognize CSS variables as a valid type. But yeah, that's just because I'm using React with TypeScript here. And if you do that, we now defined this num item. Let's add a s num items, and we can use that inside of our CSS as well. Because what can we do with it? Well, let me show you. We're gonna add a animation delay, and that will be calc var speed divided by var num items. And then you already see that Copilot is suggesting it. We also need to have one more variable, which is the current index of our element. Because this way, if I will show you that in a comment, we would have, for example, 10 seconds divided by 3 items is 3.3333 seconds. And if you're then the second item, it would have a delay times 2 would be 6.666 seconds. So this way, all of these items are evenly spread over the total duration. But let's make this a little bit more apparent by going into our marquee, and we're going to say single slide speed, which is calc speed divided by number of items. So now we can simply go in here and we can say var single slide speed times item index, which we're also going to make a bob case item index. And then the only thing we still have to do is we need to define this index. You can do it in CSS by creating marquee item and then nth child 1, 0, and then you can define that. However, I think it would be better if you would go again back into your HTML and simply add style tag on each of the different items. Item index is 1, 2, 3. And I'm also going to change this item index to item position because I let Copilot do the thinking and it came up with index. However, since numbers are 1 based, index could be confusing. So I'm going to make it item position, and we're going to change this to item position 2. And then let's have a look. You will see that each of the different items is now delayed. And once it gets to the beginning, then it hops back to the end, and then you will see it moves all the way out of view again. And then it hops back to the end. And look at that, we pretty much already have an infinite marquee by giving all of these elements their own delay. So let's add in 2 more items and see what happens. So I uncommented 2 more items. That means we need to copy these styles on there as well and give them the correct position. Plus we need to go to our num items and we need to change that to 5 as well. And then you start to see that something is not working as you might have expected it. The reason this is not working as you expect is because we are saying each card should move over the duration of 20 seconds from right to left over the distance of the total visible portion. However, if you would imagine like a carousel slider, it would take 20 seconds to move over the total distance of this carousel, not only over the distance of the visible portion. So that means that the CQW unit that we're using is actually not correct. But what do we need to use? Well, we need to use a calculation based on the number of items. So we need to calculate the total width of all of the items combined, meaning that we need to have a variable called item width, which is 300 pixels. And then we're gonna take this item width and also change that inside of our marquee item just for consistency. And then we actually need to create another variable, or at least I like to create variables. You can of course do an inline calc, but we're gonna create a variable called track width. That track width variable is the number of items times the item width. And in fact, it should actually be the number of items minus 1, but I will show you that in a second. Because first we're gonna take this track width and we're gonna copy that and we're gonna change the CQW unit. So now our marquee track is way longer, and the distance over which all of the cards move is equal to the total distance of all of the cards combined, which would also be the case if you would have like a real slider. However, remember that we're also using the 100 CQW inside of our animation, and we can still use that unit. However, that container width unit shouldn't be based on the visible portion of the marquee, but rather on the total width of the track. And since we're not using the container width of the marquee itself anymore, we can simply take this container type and define it on the track. So this way, the CQW unit that the children use is now the width of the track, meaning that they move over the total distance of the track. And as you then can see, all of the cards are actually moving and are moving out of view at the right time and will only come back once the rest has passed. That is because if we would zoom out, you will see that they get added at the very end of the track. One thing you also notice though is that there is a gap, and this gap is not something that we have defined. And that's exactly why I said we needed to use the total number of items minus 1. Reason being that if we would take a look at our CSS grid, then you will see that we add the items on the right side of that track, while this track already is the total width now of all of the cards combined. Meaning that we're actually adding one card more in distance that the cards need to move, and thus you get this gap. That gap might already be something you like, but I'd rather control the width of that gap as well, so we will add that back in a second. First, we're gonna change that track width by subtracting 1, so this way all of the items are right next to each other again. And then we can add in this gap ourselves. Let's say gap, or maybe even item gap, is 25 pixels. And then we're gonna say item width plus gap is the width plus the gap. And then we're gonna take this variable and we're gonna use that instead of only the width. And now you will see we have a beautiful gap as well, but this time we control the width instead of some gap magically appearing. And with that, we're suddenly pretty close to a fully looping marquee. But one thing we still need to fix, of course, is making sure that we hide this overflow. So let's go back to our marquee element and we're gonna add overflow hidden. Plus, I'm also gonna pick this fade out horizontal mask that I've also added to the previous carousel and you also find on my recipe page, so things look just a little bit better. So we're gonna take that fade out horizontal and we're gonna add that to our marquee. And then we're also gonna show all of the other logos because let's make it even nicer, meaning that we need to set all of the different positions on our items again, which of course you could loop through, for example, and do this in a better way than manually like I'm doing. But for now, this will work. And of course, update the total number of items to 11 as well. And with that, we already have a bit better looking marquee, but let's remove that border and also make it a bit wider and change the speed. We change the speed to, for example, 25 seconds. The width, we're gonna let that be 100%, but we're gonna add a max width of, for example, 1800 pixels. So that way, if you would have a really large screen, it won't show any gaps if you have too little items. And then we're gonna remove that border as well. Plus we're gonna remove this margin left. And look at that. All of a sudden we have this beautiful looking marquee. There is, however, one thing that I didn't show you yet, and that is what happens if I refresh. You won't see anything because the elements start out of view and they are currently moving into view, and it just takes a while before they appear. That is because all of them start at the outside of the container. Look. There they are. The way we can change that is by going back to our animation delay and multiplying it by -1. So this way, if we would have a delay of 5 seconds, it will now become -5 seconds. And the negative delay will actually move the animation forwards in time, meaning that if an element would have -20, or I believe we added 25, -25 as a delay, it will actually already be at the end of its animation when the page loads. And from that point on, it will just start looping again. So if we would go back and we would refresh, you see that we all of a sudden see all of the cards right away, and then again they start looping. Finally, the only thing left is making the marquee also move the other way, and we're gonna do that just the same as with the text marquee. We're gonna go to the animation, and by default the animation direction will be forwards. However, we can also change that to reverse, and if you would use reverse, you will already see that the animation just plays in the other direction. And then we can make this configurable by CSS variables. So we can say var direction or forwards. And this way, if we would go back to the HTML and we would simply copy the whole marquee, wrap it in a React fragment because we now have multiple elements, then we can go to the second item and we can add a direction on there. which we call reverse. And now you see, we all of a sudden have two beautiful marquees. And if you would add some margin to them, of course, they would look even more beautiful. And look at that, all of a sudden we have a beautiful looking marquee where we have 0 repetition in the code. And of course, everything works beautifully responsive because it will just show as many items as will fit. Plus, looking back at it, I think it's not that much code. It's mainly explaining a lot to you how this works, but in the end, it's not a lot of code to make something like this. Like always, link down below, you will also find a page where you can find the code so you can easily copy paste it. And that's then pretty much all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please leave a comment below because that absolutely helps my channel. Plus, click that subscribe button. Why not? It's literally the only thing you have to do to support me in this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.